The wolf came out of the dark trees, with blood soaking through his fur, and Alira knew, before he even collapsed at her feet, that this one was different from all the others. She had healed dozens of wolves before him. Some came limping, some came crawling, some came so weak that she had to carry them the last few steps into her cottage with her own bare hands. But none of them had ever come with fear in their eyes the way this one did. He kept glancing back at the tree line, as if something far worse than his wounds was still out there, waiting. Alira knelt beside him without hesitation. She never hesitated. That was the thing about her that nobody in the village of Hollow Creek could quite explain. A woman who lived alone at the edge of the forest, who kept no dog, no husband, no protection of any kind, and yet somehow the fiercest, most dangerous creatures in the world came to her, instead of tearing her apart. "You're safe here," she whispered, pressing a folded cloth against the gash along his side. "Whatever is chasing you, it stops at my door." The wolf whimpered, and slowly, the shape of him began to change. Fur receded into skin, claws softened into fingers. Within a few breaths, a young man lay in her herb garden instead of a wolf, pale and shaking, clutching his ribs. "Finn," he managed to say, giving her his name, as though it might be the last thing he ever gave anyone. "They said you wouldn't ask questions." "I won't," Alira said, already reaching for her bag of dried yarrow and crushed comfrey. "Not tonight." She had built her whole life around that promise. No questions, just healing. It was not something she had chosen. Not exactly. It was something that had chosen her, the way a stream chooses the lowest path down a hill, cutting a channel that had always been there, waiting to be found. As a child, she had once calmed a starving stray dog with nothing but the sound of her voice, and the whole village had called it luck. Then it happened again, with a half-wild horse that had thrown 3 grown men, before it let her walk up and rest a hand on its neck. And then, 3 years ago, it happened with a wolf, a real one, teeth bared and eyes wild with pain, and instead of running, Alira had simply walked toward it, and it had gone still, like a held breath finally released. Since then, word had traveled through the deep places of the forest in ways she did not fully understand. Wolves who could take the shape of men. Wolves who ruled entire territories the way kings ruled kingdoms. They called her something she had never asked to be called. A healer who did not just mend flesh, but mended fear itself. She never advertised what she did. She never needed to. The wounded simply found her, the way water finds the lowest ground. Finn's eyes fluttered as the herbs began to work, easing the fire in his blood. "You don't know who you're protecting," he murmured. "You don't know who's looking for people like me." "I don't need to know," Alira said gently, wiping sweat from his brow. "I only need to know that you're hurt, and I can help. He'll come for you eventually." Finn's voice had dropped to almost nothing, his eyes struggling to stay open. The king doesn't let deserters live, and he doesn't let anyone hide them either. Alira paused for only a moment, her hands still against the cloth on his wound. She had heard whispers of a king before, always from wolves, too frightened to say more, as if the very word might summon him. She had never let herself dwell on it. Kings were for stories, for legends told by firesides. Her world was small. It was herbs and bandages, and the quiet, steady work of easing pain, one broken creature at a time. "Rest now," she told him, and though his eyes were wide with warning, exhaustion finally won, and he slept. She sat beside him through the night, changing his bandages, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window. She had lived alone in this cottage since she was 17, ever since her mother passed and left her the small house at the edge of the woods, along with a garden full of healing plants and a reputation nobody in Hollow Creek fully trusted. The villagers were kind enough from a distance. They bought her tinctures for fevers and her salves for burns, but they also crossed themselves when they thought she wasn't looking, because everyone knew that no ordinary woman lived so close to wolf territory without being torn apart within a season. Alira had never been afraid of that. If anything, she found more peace among the wild things of the forest than she ever had among people. Wolves did not lie. They did not pretend to be something they weren't. Their pain was honest, and so was their gratitude. By morning, Finn was strong enough to sit up, color returning to his face. He watched her move around the small kitchen, boiling water, cutting herbs, humming softly under her breath, as though the night before had been nothing more than an ordinary evening. "You really don't know what you are, do you?" he said quietly. Elira glanced at him, amused despite herself. "I'm a healer. That's all I am." "No," Finn said, shaking his head slowly. "You're something the old wolves used to talk about. A story I thought was just a story, until I saw you last night, calming a wolf who was ready to die from fear before the wound even had a chance to kill him." "Every creature can be calmed," Elira said simply, setting a cup of warm broth in front of him. "You just have to be willing to sit still long enough to listen to what they need." Finn studied her for a long moment, something like awe mixing with the exhaustion still lingering in his eyes. "The king isn't going to see it that way. Not when he finds out how many of us have come through your door and disappeared before his soldiers could catch us." "Then let him come," Elira said, and there was no fear in her voice at all, only the same calm steadiness she used with every wounded creature she had ever tended. "I don't punish the hurt. I heal them. That's never going to change, no matter who comes asking." She had no idea, in that quiet moment, with the morning light spilling through her window, how soon those words would be tested. She did not know that far beyond the tree line, in a stone hall built into the mountainside, a king ruled over every pack in the region, with an iron will and a temper that had never once been challenged. She did not know that his soldiers had been tracking the strange pattern of disappearances for weeks, wounded wolves vanishing from the edges of battle, only to reappear healthy days later, loyal to no pack, owing allegiance to no one. She did not know that the king had grown so furious over the disruption to his order that he had sworn, in front of his entire council, to find whoever was responsible and end it himself. All she knew, in that moment, was that another wolf needed her, and that was enough. By midday, Finn was strong enough to walk, and though he thanked her more times than she could count, he also warned her again before he left, his voice low and urgent. "Please," he said, standing at her doorway, with the forest waiting behind him. "Be careful. Word is already spreading fast. Someone powerful is going to come looking for the person who keeps stealing his enemies out from under him." Elira only smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then I hope he's hungry, because I always have soup ready for guests." Finn didn't laugh, though she meant it as something close to a joke. Instead, his expression turned grave, almost pitying, as though he already knew something she didn't. "You don't understand. The king isn't like the wolves you've healed. He doesn't come to be helped. He comes to punish." Then he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Elira standing alone in her doorway, the forest quiet and still around her, giving no warning at all of the storm that was already beginning to move toward her, from somewhere deep within its heart. She spent the rest of the day as she spent every day, tending her garden, grinding herbs, checking on an elderly villager with a bad cough, delivering a tincture to a mother whose child had a fever. Life in Hollow Creek moved slowly and predictably, the same rhythm it had followed for as long as she could remember. She liked it that way. She liked knowing what each day would bring, even as the forest at the edge of her life held secrets far larger than she understood. That night, as she banked the fire and prepared for bed, she thought about Finn's warning, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over an unfamiliar herb, testing its scent, trying to understand its nature. A king who ruled every wolf in the region, a king who punished instead of healed. It was strange to imagine such a person existing so close to her quiet, simple life, and stranger still to imagine that her small acts of kindness could somehow be enough to draw his attention. She told herself it was nothing. Wolves exaggerated, just like people did. Whoever this king was, he was probably nothing more than a proud alpha, with too much pride and too little patience, the kind of creature who barked louder than he bit. She had no way of knowing, as she drifted off to sleep with the scent of dried herbs still clinging to her hands, that somewhere beyond the mountains, that very king was standing over a map marked with the locations of every wolf who had vanished after being healed, his jaw tight with fury, his golden eyes narrowed with a fury few had ever survived. And she had no way of knowing that soon, very soon, he would be standing at her door. Kale stood at the head of the long stone table in his mountain hall, staring down at a map covered in small red markers, each one representing a place where a wounded wolf had vanished without a trace. 7 markers in the last 2 months alone, 7 soldiers, deserters and enemies who should have been captured, punished, or left to die from their wounds on the battlefield, instead walking free somewhere in his territory, healthy and untouchable. He was the Alpha King, ruler of every pack within 100 miles of these mountains, and no one defied him without consequence. No one except, it seemed, whoever kept interfering with his order from the shadows. "Report," he said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of calm that made his most seasoned warriors more nervous than shouting ever could. Corin, his second-in-command and oldest friend, stepped forward with a scroll in hand. He had fought beside Cale since they were young pups learning to shift for the first time, and he was one of the few in the entire kingdom who dared to meet the king's eyes without flinching. "Every wolf who vanished was last seen near the border of Hollow Creek," Corin said. "Human territory. No pack claims it, which is why no one thought to watch it closely." Cale's jaw tightened. "A human village is somehow hiding my enemies from me." "Not the village," Corin said carefully. "One person. A woman. The villagers call her a healer, nothing more. But every wolf who vanished was wounded before they disappeared, and every one of them reappeared days later, fully healed, loyal to no pack at all." Cale's eyes flared gold, the mark of his wolf pressing close beneath his skin, restless and furious. A single human woman is undoing months of careful strategy. It would seem so. And no one has questioned her? No one has stopped her. Corin hesitated, choosing his next words with obvious care. "The wolves who go to her don't speak of it easily. Those who do, speak of her strangely, as though she isn't entirely human at all. Some say she calms even the most feral wolves with nothing but her voice." Cale let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound sharp enough to make the younger warriors along the table shift uncomfortably. "A witch, then, or a very clever liar who has convinced an entire forest of wolves that she is something more than she is." "Perhaps," Corin said, "or perhaps she is exactly what the old stories used to warn us about." Cale's gaze snapped toward him. "What stories?" Corin glanced around the table, aware that several of the younger wolves present had never heard the old legends, the ones passed down only in whispers from elder to elder. He chose not to elaborate in front of them. "A conversation for another time, my king. For now, the more pressing matter is what to do about her." Cale turned back to the map, his fingers pressing hard against the edge of the table until the wood creaked beneath his grip. 7 wolves gone. 7 pieces of leverage stripped away from him in the middle of a fragile peace that had taken years to build between rival packs. If word spread that his own territory could not be controlled, that a lone human woman could steal his enemies out from under him without consequence, it would not only embarrass him, it would invite every ambitious alpha in the region to test how far his authority truly reached. He would not allow that. He had built this kingdom from nothing, clawing his way to power through battles that had cost him more than most of his warriors would ever understand. He had not survived those years, had not buried friends and rivals alike, only to watch his authority crumble because of one stubborn healer hiding in the woods. "I'll go myself," Cale said. The hall went silent. Even Corin blinked in surprise. "My king, that isn't necessary. Send a patrol. Send me. There's no need for you to." "I said I will go myself," Cale repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If she is powerful enough to undo my authority from the shadows, then she deserves to see exactly who she has been defying. And if she is nothing more than a clever human hiding behind rumors, then she will learn very quickly what happens to those who interfere with my kingdom." Corin studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, though he said nothing further. He knew better than most that once Cale made a decision, arguing against it only wasted breath better spent preparing for what came next. "As you wish," Corin said finally, bowing his head. "I'll ready an escort." "No escort," Cale said. "I go alone." "My king, that's—" "Alone," Cale said again, the finality in his tone closing the conversation completely. He did not fully understand his own reasoning, even as the words left his mouth. It was not caution that made him want to go without an escort. If anything, caution would have demanded he bring every warrior he could spare. It was something else entirely, something he could not name, a restless pull low in his chest that had been growing steadily worse ever since Corin first mentioned the healer's name. He told himself it was simply the desire to handle the matter personally, to ensure it was dealt with swiftly and without complication. A king who could not manage a single human woman did not deserve the throne he sat upon. That night, as the mountain hall emptied and the fires burned low, Cale stood alone at the window of his chamber, staring out at the dark line of forest that separated his territory from the human world beyond it. Somewhere out there, past the tree line, was the woman who had managed, in a matter of months, to accomplish what entire rival packs had failed to do for years. She had found a way to slip past his authority entirely, undetected, unchallenged, and unafraid. He did not know her face. He did not know her voice. And yet something about the very idea of her set his wolf on edge, in a way he had not felt in a very long time. A restless energy that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with something he refused to examine too closely. He told himself it was simply the anticipation of finally solving a problem that had eluded him for months. He told himself that whatever unease stirred in his chest was nothing more than the natural instinct of a predator closing in on unfamiliar prey. By dawn, he had made his decision final. He would ride out alone, find the healer responsible for undoing his authority, and make an example of her severe enough that no human, no wolf, and no rival pack would ever again mistake his mercy for weakness. He gathered nothing but a single blade and the clothes on his back, shifting easily into his wolf form as he left the mountain hall behind him, moving swiftly and silently through the dense trees that separated his world from hers. The forest blurred past him, familiar and comforting beneath his paws, the scent of pine and damp earth grounding him, even as the unfamiliar pull in his chest grew stronger with every mile that passed. He crossed into human territory, just as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and rose. Hollow Creek lay quiet and unaware below him, small wooden houses scattered along winding dirt paths, smoke curling gently from chimneys as the village slowly woke to another ordinary day. Cale paused at the edge of the tree line, his wolf senses sharp and alert, searching for any hint of the woman who had caused him so much trouble. It did not take long to find her scent, faint but unmistakable among the mingled smells of herbs and wood smoke, drifting from a small cottage at the very edge of the village, closer to the forest than any other home in Hollow Creek. He watched from the shadows for a long moment, studying the cottage with narrowed eyes, cataloging every detail with the careful precision of a predator preparing to strike. A modest garden grew along the side of the house, filled with plants he recognized as healing herbs. A worn path led from the front door directly into the forest, well trodden, as though it had been used many times by creatures moving quickly and quietly under the cover of night. Everything about the scene confirmed exactly what he had suspected. This was no ordinary healer tending to villagers with common colds and minor injuries. This was the source of every disruption to his authority, hiding in plain sight at the very edge of his territory. Anger flared hot and sharp in his chest, sharpening his focus, steadying his resolve. Whatever unease had unsettled him throughout the journey here vanished beneath the familiar, controlled fury that had carried him through every battle he had ever fought. He stepped out of the tree line and moved toward the cottage with slow, deliberate steps, his wolf form shifting seamlessly back into the body of a man as he approached the door. He would not attack without warning. He was not a monster, whatever stories the wolves might whisper about him, but he would make certain, in no uncertain terms, that whoever lived behind that door understood exactly what price came with defying the Alpha King. He raised his hand and knocked once, hard enough to rattle the wood in its frame. A moment later, the door opened, and Cale found himself staring into a pair of calm, steady eyes that did not flinch, did not widen with fear, did not react at all, the way he expected from a woman who had just opened her door, to find the most powerful wolf in the region standing on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" Elira asked, her voice as even and unbothered as if he were nothing more than a traveler asking for directions. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Cale found himself, for just a moment, completely at a loss for words. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Cale stood on the doorstep, his golden eyes fixed on the woman in front of him, searching for the fear he expected to find, and finding nothing of the sort. She simply waited, one hand resting against the doorframe, her expression polite but unreadable, as though powerful strangers appeared at her cottage every single day. "You are the healer," Cale said finally, his voice low and edged with warning. "I am," Elira replied simply. "And you are standing on my herb bed." Cale glanced down, surprised to find that he had indeed stepped directly onto a small patch of carefully tended plants, crushing several delicate stems beneath his boots. He stepped back without thinking, an instinctive reaction that startled him more than he cared to admit. He was not a man who apologized for where he chose to stand, and yet something about the calm irritation in her voice made him move before he had even decided to. "I'm not here to discuss your garden," he said, recovering his composure quickly, his tone hardening once more. "No," Illyra agreed, studying him carefully now, taking in the fine but simple clothing, the quiet authority in his posture, the way even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to have gone silent since his arrival. "I don't suppose you are." "You've been harboring wolves who don't belong to you," Cale said, stepping closer, his height and presence meant to intimidate, meant to remind her exactly how small and vulnerable she truly was, standing alone at the edge of the forest. "Deserters. Enemies. Wolves who owed loyalty and punishment, both of which you have stolen from me." Illyra did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She simply tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same careful, curious attention she might give to an unfamiliar plant, trying to determine whether it was safe to touch, or something that required more caution. "I don't ask who they belong to," she said. "I only ask if they're hurt." "That is not your decision to make," Cale said, his voice rising slightly, frustration bleeding into his words despite his effort to remain controlled. "Every wolf in this territory belongs to me. Every punishment, every mercy, every fate is mine to decide, not yours." "And yet," Illyra said, her voice still maddeningly calm, "here you are, standing on my doorstep instead of theirs, which tells me that whatever fate you intended for them, they preferred mine instead." Cale's eyes flashed, his wolf pressing hard and sudden against the surface of his control, a wave of anger rolling through him at her audacity, at the sheer nerve of a human woman speaking to him as though he were nothing more than an ordinary man with an ordinary grievance. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. "No idea what kind of chaos you've invited by interfering with matters that were never yours to interfere with." "Then explain it to me," Illyra said simply. The request caught him off guard. He had expected fear. He had expected pleading, or defiance born from ignorance, or perhaps tears, though something told him tears were the least likely reaction this particular woman would ever offer. He had not expected a calm, genuine request to understand. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said instead, falling back on the only ground that felt familiar. "I owe you punishment for defying the authority of the Alpha King." Something flickered across Illyra's face then, not fear, but recognition. "So you're him," she said quietly, "the king they warned me about." "Yes," Cale said, watching her closely, waiting for the fear to finally arrive now that she understood exactly who stood in front of her. It never came. "I see," she said simply, and then, to his complete astonishment, she stepped back from the doorway and gestured him inside. "You should come in then. It's cold, and whatever punishment you've decided for me, I'd rather not catch a fever before you get around to delivering it." Cale stared at her, momentarily stunned into silence. In all his years ruling this territory, no one had ever responded to him this way, with such calm, unbothered practicality, as though his fury and his title meant less to her than the temperature outside. He should have refused. He should have delivered whatever punishment he had planned right there on the doorstep and returned to his mountain hall before nightfall. Instead, against every instinct honed through years of rigid discipline, he found himself stepping through her doorway and into the warm, herb-scented interior of her cottage. The inside of the home was small but tidy, filled with bundles of drying plants hanging from the ceiling, shelves lined with carefully labeled jars, and a fire crackling gently in the hearth. It smelled of lavender, and something earthier beneath it, comforting in a way that unsettled him more than any battlefield ever had. "Sit if you'd like," Illyra said, moving toward the fire to add another log, entirely unbothered by the fact that the most feared wolf in the region was standing in the middle of her home. "Or don't. I imagine kings don't often sit when they're busy delivering punishments." Cale remained standing, watching her with narrowed eyes, trying to understand the strange calm that radiated from her, trying to determine whether it was bravery, or foolishness, or something else entirely that he did not yet have a name for. "You should be afraid of me," he said finally, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. Elira glanced back at him, something almost gentle in her expression. Should I be? You haven't hurt me. You haven't hurt anyone I've healed, not that I've seen. You've only told me that I've upset you, which, respectfully, isn't quite the same thing as giving me a reason to fear you. I could hurt you, Cale said, though even as he spoke the words, something inside him recoiled sharply at the very thought, a reaction so visceral it nearly staggered him. You could, Elira agreed simply, but I don't think you will. And why is that? Cale demanded, frustration mounting once more at her infuriating calm. Elira considered the question for a moment, studying him with the same quiet attention she gave every wounded creature that crossed her threshold. Because you didn't come here with soldiers, you didn't come here with chains, or weapons, or anyone to witness whatever punishment you intended to deliver. You came alone, and in my experience, people who truly intend to hurt someone rarely come alone. They come with an audience, because cruelty likes to be seen. Cale had no response for that. He stood in the middle of her small, warm cottage, his fury slowly draining away into something far more complicated and far less familiar, an unsettled confusion he had not experienced since he was a very young wolf, still learning the shape of his own power. I came to make an example of you, he said finally, though the words carried far less conviction than they had on her doorstep. Then make it, Elira said simply, spreading her hands in a small, open gesture. I won't stop you, and I won't run. But before you do, I'd like to know what exactly you think I've done wrong. Because from where I'm standing, all I've done is refuse to let hurt creatures suffer when I had the means to help them. Cale opened his mouth to answer, to explain the delicate balance of power between rival packs, the careful strategy required to maintain order across a territory as vast and volatile as his, the way a single act of unchecked mercy could unravel years of hard-won peace. But before he could speak a single word, something shifted low in his chest, a pressure building beneath his skin that he recognized instantly and dreaded immediately. His wolf was rising, unbidden and unwelcome, pressing hard against the careful control he had spent years perfecting. No, he muttered under his breath, taking a sharp step backward. Not now. Elira's expression shifted instantly from calm curiosity to focused concern, the same practiced attentiveness she gave every wounded creature the moment she sensed something was wrong. Are you all right? Stay back, Cale warned, his voice strained as he fought against the transformation threatening to overtake him, confusion and fury tangling together inside him, because his wolf never rose without his permission, not once in all the years since he had first learned to control the change. But it was rising now, faster than he could stop it, pulled forward by something in the room, something in her presence that called to the very core of what he was in a way nothing ever had before. Elira did not run. She did not scream. She simply watched, steady and unafraid, as the powerful, controlled king, standing in her cottage, began, against his own will, to lose the fight against his own beast. The change came over him in a rush, faster and rougher than any transformation he had experienced in years. Bones shifted beneath his skin, fabric tearing, as his shoulders broadened and his frame lowered toward the ground, fur spreading across his body, until, within moments, the powerful, controlled Alpha King had vanished, replaced by an enormous wolf standing in the middle of Elira's small cottage. Cale expected fury. He expected the wild, uncontrollable rage that usually accompanied an unplanned shift, the kind of primal aggression that had, more than once, resulted in broken furniture and frightened onlookers back at the mountain hall. He braced himself for violence, for the humiliating loss of control that would surely follow. Instead, the moment his eyes found Elira standing calmly in front of him, something in his chest simply stopped fighting. His legs folded beneath him before he even understood what was happening, lowering his massive body to the floor of her cottage until he lay curled at her feet, his great head resting against the worn wooden floorboards, a low, involuntary whimper escaping his throat. He had never made a sound like that in his life, not as a pup learning his first shift, not even in the worst moments of the battles that had cost him nearly everything. And yet here he was, the most powerful wolf in the entire territory, lying submissively on the floor of a human woman's cottage, whimpering like a wounded creature begging for comfort. Elira did not hesitate. She knelt down beside him immediately, her hands moving with the same gentle, practiced confidence she used with every wolf who had ever come through her door. No fear at all in her touch, as she rested her palm against the side of his massive head. "There now," she murmured softly, her voice low and soothing. "Whatever that was, it's over now, you're all right." Cale's entire body trembled beneath her touch, torn between the humiliating loss of control and an overwhelming unfamiliar sense of relief that flooded through him the moment her hand made contact with his fur. It was as though something deep inside him, something he had carried for years without even realizing its weight, had finally been allowed to rest. He tried to fight it. He tried to summon the fury, the authority, the icy control that defined every moment of his life as king. But none of it came. There was only the warmth of her hand, the steady sound of her voice, and the strange, terrifying peace settling over him despite every instinct screaming that he should be furious, that he should never allow himself to be seen this way by anyone, let alone the very human he had come here to punish. "I don't know what just happened," Illyra admitted quietly, continuing to stroke gently along his neck, the same motion she used to calm every frightened creature that came to her for help. "But I think, whatever it was, you needed it more than you wanted to admit." Cale let out another low sound, somewhere between a growl and a groan, frustration and confusion mixing together in a way that made him want to snap at her hand, and simultaneously, never wanted her to stop touching him. They stayed like that for what felt like a very long time, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the cottage warm and quiet around them, until finally Cale felt the strange, overwhelming pull begin to ease, his wolf slowly settling back beneath the surface, until he could feel the shift reversing, his body returning to its human form. He came back to himself lying on the floor of her cottage, half dressed in torn remnants of his clothing, staring up at the ceiling with a mixture of humiliation and disbelief that he had never once experienced in his entire life as ruler of these lands. Illyra, to her credit, did not laugh, did not mock him, did not react with anything other than the same calm practicality she had shown from the very beginning. She simply rose, retrieved a blanket from a nearby chest, and draped it over him without comment, giving him a moment to gather himself before she spoke again. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Cale sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around his shoulders, his mind racing through explanations, none of which made any sense. His wolf had never once acted against his will. Not in battle, not in anger, not even in the earliest, most uncontrolled years of his youth. And yet here, in this small cottage, surrounded by the scent of dried herbs and burning wood, his beast had simply surrendered, without a single command from him. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, though the accusation carried far less force than he intended, still shaken by what had just occurred. "I didn't do anything," Illyra said honestly, setting a kettle over the fire. "I never do anything, except be still and let the fear settle. Whatever happened, it came from inside you, not from me." Cale studied her carefully, searching for any hint of deception, any sign that she was manipulating him in ways he could not detect. He found nothing but the same calm, steady honesty she had shown since the moment he arrived. "This has never happened before," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Maybe it needed to," Illyra said simply, pouring hot water over a small handful of dried herbs before handing him the cup. "From what I understand, wolves who fight constantly, who carry the weight of leadership and battle without ever setting it down, sometimes reach a point where their own bodies demand a moment of rest, whether their minds are ready to allow it or not." Cale took the cup without thinking, more out of instinct than genuine desire for tea, his mind still reeling from the loss of control he had just experienced. "You speak as though you understand wolves better than we understand ourselves." "I understand pain," Illyra said simply, "and fear. Those two things look remarkably similar in every creature I've ever treated, human or wolf alike." Cale fell silent, staring down into the cup in his hands, the warmth seeping into his palms as he tried to process everything that had just happened. He had come here with fury, with clear intention, with the absolute certainty that he would leave this cottage having delivered exactly the punishment this healer deserved for defying his authority. Instead, he had lost control of his own wolf for the first time in his adult life, and somehow, impossibly, he felt calmer sitting on the floor of her cottage than he had felt in longer than he could remember. "I should go," he said finally, though he made no immediate move to rise. "You should," Elira agreed. Though you might want to find some proper clothing first, unless you intend to walk back through the village wrapped in nothing but my good blanket. Despite everything, despite the confusion and the humiliation still simmering beneath the surface, Cale felt something almost like the beginning of a laugh catch in his throat, quickly suppressed but not entirely gone. You find this amusing, he said, glancing at her. I find it human, Elira said gently, even for a king. Cale rose slowly, pulling the blanket more securely around himself, his mind still spinning with questions he did not yet have answers for. He had come here to punish a defiant healer who had undermined his authority. Instead, he was leaving with his wolf calmer than it had been in years, his fury replaced by a bewildering curiosity he did not want to examine too closely. This isn't finished, he said as he moved toward the door, though the warning carried far less conviction than it had when he first arrived. No, Elira agreed quietly, watching him go with an expression he could not quite read. I don't suppose it is. He left her cottage as the sun began to set, shifting back into his wolf form the moment he crossed into the tree line, running hard and fast through the forest, as though speed alone could outrun the confusion, still tangled tightly in his chest. But no matter how far or how fast he ran, he could not shake the memory of her hand resting gently against his fur, or the strange, unfamiliar peace that had settled over him the moment she touched him. By the time he reached his mountain hall, deep in the night, he had made no progress at all in understanding what had happened to him. He only knew, with a certainty that unsettled him more than any battle ever had, that whatever had occurred in that small cottage at the edge of Hollow Creek was far from over. Cale did not sleep that night. He sat in his chamber long after the mountain hall had gone quiet, staring into the dying embers of his fire, replaying the events at the cottage over and over in his mind, searching for an explanation that made sense. He was the Alpha King. His control over his own wolf was absolute, forged through years of discipline and hard-won battles, and yet a single afternoon in the presence of a quiet, unassuming healer had undone that control as easily as untying a loose knot. By morning, he had convinced himself of a single, reasonable explanation: exhaustion. He had been pushing himself too hard for too long, managing border disputes, settling council arguments, hunting down the source of his missing enemies. His wolf had simply reached its breaking point, and the healer's cottage, quiet and warm, had merely provided the first opportunity for that exhaustion to surface. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, he knew somewhere in the back of his mind, not entirely true. He told himself he needed to return to Hollow Creek only to investigate further, to understand exactly how many wolves she had healed, and where their loyalties now stood, information any responsible king would require, before deciding how to handle a growing threat to his authority. He told himself the visit had nothing to do with the strange, restless pull still lingering in his chest, or the memory of her calm voice, or the unfamiliar peace he had not felt in years. He told himself a great many things that morning, and believed almost none of them. By mid-afternoon, he found himself once again standing at the edge of the forest, watching Elira's cottage from the shadows of the tree line, this time with no intention of announcing himself. He told himself he was simply observing, gathering information, behaving exactly as a careful, strategic ruler should. He watched her move through her garden, gathering herbs with practiced efficiency, pausing occasionally to examine a leaf or check the color of a root before continuing her work. She moved with the same calm steadiness he had witnessed the day before, unhurried and unbothered, as though the world around her held no threats worth worrying over. He was still watching when a young wolf stumbled out of the trees on the far side of her property, one leg dragging uselessly behind him, blood matting the fur along his flank. Cale recognized the wolf immediately, a rogue from a rival territory who had been causing trouble along the eastern border for weeks. Cale tensed, ready to intervene, ready to finally capture the troublesome rogue who had evaded his patrols for so long. But before he could move, Elira was already crossing her garden toward the wounded wolf, her posture calm, her hands empty and open, offering no threat at all. The rogue wolf, wild and dangerous by every account Cale had received, did not attack her. He did not even flinch away. Instead, he simply collapsed at her feet, exhausted and trusting, exactly as Cale himself had done the day before. Cale watched, transfixed, as Elira knelt beside the wounded creature, speaking softly, her hands moving with gentle confidence, as she assessed his injuries. There was no fear in her at all, no hesitation, only the same quiet focus she brought to every task, as natural to her as breathing. It was not sorcery. Cale had assumed, when Corin first suggested it, that some kind of trickery or dark magic must be responsible for her unusual influence over wolves. But watching her now, he understood with sudden clarity that there was no magic at all, not in the way he had imagined. There was only genuine, unwavering calm, offered freely and without judgment to any creature in pain, wolf or human alike. It was, in its own way, more powerful than any magic he had ever encountered. He remained hidden in the trees for hours, watching as she tended the rogue wolf's wounds, cleaning and bandaging the injury with the same careful precision she had used on him the day before. The wolf never once tried to attack her, never once showed any sign of the aggression that had made him such a persistent problem along the border. He simply lay still, trusting her completely, exactly as Cale had. By the time the sun began to set, Cale finally understood that he needed answers beyond what simple observation could provide. He needed to speak with someone who might understand what he had witnessed, someone with knowledge that extended beyond battle strategy and border disputes. He returned to the mountain hall that evening and immediately sought out Leora, the oldest and most respected elder in his pack, a wolf who had lived through generations of leadership changes and carried more ancient knowledge than anyone else in his kingdom. He found her in her private chamber, surrounded by old scrolls and the faint, comforting scent of dried sage, her silver hair pulled back in the same simple braid she had worn for as long as Cale could remember. "My king," she said, rising slowly to greet him, though her sharp eyes immediately noted the tension in his shoulders, the unusual weariness in his expression. "Something troubles you." "I need to know about old legends," Cale said, dispensing with formalities entirely, too unsettled to bother with the usual careful diplomacy he extended even to his most trusted advisors. "Stories about humans with unusual influence over wolves. Corin mentioned something, briefly, before I dismissed it as superstition." Leora's expression shifted immediately, something between recognition and concern passing across her weathered features. "You've met her then, the healer from Hollow Creek." Cale's eyes narrowed. "You know of her." "I know of the old stories," Leora corrected gently, gesturing for him to sit before easing herself back into her own chair. "Whether she is truly what those stories describe, I cannot say without meeting her myself. But if what I've heard from the younger wolves is accurate, it would not surprise me at all." "Tell me," Cale said, his patience thin, his need for answers greater than his usual careful composure. Leora studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly, reaching for one of the oldest scrolls on her shelf, its edges worn and fragile with age. "There is an old legend, passed down through generations of pack elders, about a rare kind of human soul known as a soothing heart. Once in many generations, such a person is born with the ability to calm even the most feral wolf spirit, not through magic or manipulation, but through pure, unwavering compassion, so genuine that it reaches past instinct and fear, straight into the core of a wolf's very being." Cale listened in silence, his mind returning immediately to the memory of his own wolf collapsing at her feet, whimpering and submissive in a way he had never once experienced before. "The legend says," Leora continued, her voice quiet and measured, "that when a soothing heart encounters the wolf she is truly fated to bond with, his beast recognizes her instantly, surrendering completely, not out of weakness, but because for the very first time, it finally feels safe enough to rest." Cale's jaw tightened. "That's superstition, a story told to comfort frightened pups." "Perhaps," Leora said calmly, unbothered by his obvious resistance. "Or perhaps it is simply a story that has not needed telling in a very long time, because it has been many generations since a true soothing heart was born." "And if it were true," Cale said slowly, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in his mouth, "what would it mean?" Leora's expression softened slightly, sympathy replacing her usual careful neutrality. "It would mean, my king, that the fiercest alpha in the land has finally met someone capable of matching him, not through strength or dominance, but through something far rarer and far more difficult to earn. It would mean she is not merely a healer, to be tolerated or punished, but a fated equal, meant to stand beside you, rather than beneath you." Cale rose sharply from his chair, restless energy driving him to pace the length of her chamber. his mind rejecting the idea, even as some deeper, quieter part of him recognized the truth in her words. That's impossible. She's human. I am the Alpha King. My mate, if such a bond even exists for someone like me, would need to be a wolf capable of standing beside me as an equal in every sense. The old legends never specified that a soothing heart must be a wolf, Leora said gently. In fact, most stories suggest quite the opposite. The bond is not built on strength or shared nature. It is built on what a wolf needs most, which is often something entirely different from what he believes he requires. Cale stopped pacing, staring out the narrow window of her chamber toward the dark line of forest separating his territory from Hollow Creek, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of denial and reluctant recognition. I refuse to believe my wolf would choose someone so far beneath my station, he said finally, though even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow and unconvincing. Your wolf, Leora said quietly, does not concern itself with stations, my king. It concerns itself only with truth. And from what you've described, it seems your wolf has already made its choice, whether you are ready to accept it or not. Cale left her chamber that night, more unsettled than when he had arrived, the weight of her words pressing heavily against every certainty he had built his life upon. He told himself, once again, that it was nothing more than superstition, an old story with no real bearing on his life or his rule. But as he lay awake long into the night, staring up at the ceiling of his chamber, he could not stop thinking about the calm, steady sound of her voice, or the strange, undeniable peace that had settled over his wolf the moment her hand touched his fur. And despite every argument he made against it, some quiet, persistent part of him had already begun to wonder if Leora's old legend might, impossibly, be true. 3 days passed before Cale allowed himself to return to Hollow Creek. 3 days spent trying and failing to bury the strange, persistent pull that had settled into his chest since his conversation with Leora. He told himself repeatedly that a king did not chase after superstition, that his responsibilities to his territory and his people mattered far more than an old legend he did not fully believe. And yet, on the third night, he found himself once again crossing the tree line into human territory, drawn forward by something he could no longer fully deny. He did not announce himself this time either. He simply watched from a comfortable distance as Alira closed her small shop of herbs for the evening, extinguishing candles one by one, until only a single soft light remained glowing in her front window. He waited until the village had gone quiet, until the last curious eyes had returned to their own homes for the evening, before finally approaching her door and knocking, far more gently than he had the first time. Alira opened the door without hesitation, an expression of mild surprise crossing her face when she saw him standing there, though notably absent was any trace of fear. I didn't expect to see you again so soon, she said, stepping aside to let him in without being asked. I wasn't certain I would return either, Cale admitted, the honesty surprising even himself as he stepped inside. The cottage was just as warm and comfortable as he remembered, filled with the same gentle scent of dried herbs and burning wood. Alira moved toward the kettle out of habit, though she paused before filling it, glancing back at him instead. Tea, or have you come to lose control of your wolf again? Despite himself, Cale felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward, something close to amusement breaking through his usual careful composure. Tea, I think. I'd rather not repeat that particular humiliation twice in 1 week. Alira smiled faintly, setting the kettle over the fire before settling into the chair across from where he had taken a seat, unbidden, near the hearth. So, King of the Wolves, have you come to finally deliver my punishment, or have you decided instead to simply keep interrupting my evenings? Neither, Cale admitted, watching the flames dance in the fireplace rather than meeting her eyes directly. I've come because I don't understand what happened, and I find I dislike not understanding things a great deal. That sounds like a very kingly problem to have, Alira said, though there was gentle teasing rather than mockery in her tone. I spoke with one of my elders, Cale continued, deciding there was little point in circling the subject any longer. She told me an old legend, about humans born with an unusual gift for calming wolves. She called it a soothing heart. Something flickered across Alira's expression, curiosity mixed with a hint of surprise. I've never heard that particular term before, though I suppose it explains a great deal about my own life that I've never fully understood. You don't know where your ability comes from, Cale said, more statement than question. No, Alira admitted. I only know that for as long as I can remember, frightened creatures have calmed in my presence. My mother had a smaller version of it, though nothing as strong as what I seem to carry. She always told me it was simply a gift, and that gifts didn't need explaining, only using. Cale studied her carefully in the firelight, trying to reconcile the ordinary, unassuming woman sitting across from him with the extraordinary legend Leora had described. The stories suggest something more specific than a simple gift for calming animals. "Oh," Elira said, her tone carefully neutral though curiosity clearly burned behind her eyes. "Do tell." Cale hesitated, the words suddenly feeling far more significant now that he was preparing to speak them aloud to the very person they concerned. The legend suggests that when a true soothing heart encounters the wolf she is fated to bond with, his beast recognizes her instantly. That the calm she offers isn't simply general compassion, but something specific, meant only for him. The kettle began to whistle softly, and Elira rose to remove it from the fire, giving herself, Cale suspected, a moment to process his words before responding. She poured the tea slowly, methodically, before finally returning to her seat and handing him a cup. "And you believe your wolf recognized me," she said quietly, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he had begun speaking. "I don't know what I believe," Cale admitted, the honesty costing him more effort than he expected. "I have never lost control of my wolf before. Not once, in all my years as king, and yet the moment I stepped into your home, he surrendered completely, as though he had been waiting his entire life for permission to finally rest." Elira was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "I won't pretend to fully understand what that means," she said finally, "but I will say this. In all the wolves I've healed, I've never felt anything quite like what happened when you were here. Something in me recognized something in you too, though I couldn't have told you at the time what it was." Cale set his cup down carefully, his heart beating faster than the situation seemed to warrant. "That is either the beginning of something remarkable, or the beginning of a great deal of trouble for both of us." "Perhaps it's both," Elira said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her careful composure. "Most remarkable things usually are." They sat together for a long time after that, the conversation gradually shifting away from legends and prophecies towards simpler, more ordinary topics. Cale found himself, to his own considerable surprise, genuinely enjoying the exchange, learning about her life in Hollow Creek, her mother who had passed several years earlier, the quiet satisfaction she found in tending to creatures too frightened or wounded to help themselves. In turn, he found himself sharing pieces of his own life he rarely spoke of to anyone, the weight of leadership he had carried since a very young age, the constant vigilance required to maintain peace among rival packs, the loneliness that came with a position few people understood, and fewer still dared to challenge. "You carry a great deal on your shoulders," Elira observed at one point, studying him with the same quiet attentiveness she gave every wounded creature that came through her door. "It comes with the position," Cale said, though something in his tone suggested the weight had grown heavier over the years than he usually allowed himself to admit. "That doesn't mean it should go unacknowledged," Elira said gently. "Even kings deserve a moment of rest now and then." Cale found himself staring at her for a long moment, struck once again by the strange, unfamiliar peace that settled over him whenever he was near her, a calm so foreign to his usual restless vigilance that he barely recognized himself within it. "I should return before my absence draws unwanted questions," he said finally, though he made no immediate move to leave, reluctant, in a way that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Of course," Elira said, rising to walk him to the door, though her own reluctance seemed to mirror his own. "You're welcome to return, if you'd like, assuming you can manage to visit without losing control of your wolf every single time." "I make no promises," Cale said, and for the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, he allowed himself a genuine smile, small but real. He left her cottage that night with far more questions than answers, though the fury and suspicion that had first driven him here had long since faded into something far more complicated and far more difficult to name. As he made his way back through the dark forest toward his mountain hall, he found himself already thinking of reasons to return, already anticipating the quiet warmth of her cottage and the strange, steady peace she seemed to carry with her wherever she went. He did not yet understand what she truly was to him, or what the old legend might ultimately mean for a kingdom built on strength and dominance. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself looking forward to something other than the next battle, the next negotiation, the next crisis demanding his immediate attention. He was looking forward, simply and quietly, to seeing her again. What he did not know, as he crossed back into his own territory beneath a sky full of distant stars, was that his growing visits to Hollow Creek had already begun to draw attention within his own pack. Attention from those who understood far better than he did just how much danger a bond like this could bring to a kingdom built entirely on the assumption that its king answered to no one. Over the following weeks, Cale's visits to Hollow Creek became a quiet, steady rhythm neither he nor Alira spoke of directly, though both understood it had become something neither of them wished to give up. He came in the evenings, usually after his council duties concluded, slipping through the forest under the cover of darkness, to spend an hour or two in the warm, herb-scented comfort of her cottage. Their conversations grew easier with each visit, the careful formality of their first meetings gradually giving way to something more natural, more honest. Alira learned that beneath the fearsome reputation of the Alpha King lay a man who had taken the throne far younger than he should have, forced into leadership after a brutal challenge left his father unable to rule, a man who had spent years proving his strength to a pack that had initially doubted a young king could hold power at all. Cale, in turn, learned that Alira's calm, unshakable steadiness was not the absence of fear, but something she had built deliberately, piece by piece, after years of watching frightened creatures respond far better to quiet confidence than to panic. He learned that she had lost her mother to a long illness that no herb or tincture could cure, a loss that still occasionally softened her voice when she spoke of it. He learned that despite the isolation of her life at the edge of the forest, she had never once felt lonely, finding companionship instead in the steady, honest presence of the wounded creatures who trusted her with their fear. "You never ask them to be anything other than what they are," Cale observed one evening, watching her carefully clean a small cut along the paw of a young fox that had wandered in earlier that day, an ordinary creature rather than a wolf, though she tended it with the same careful attention she gave everyone who came to her. "Why would I?" Alira said simply, finishing the bandage before releasing the fox gently back into the evening air. "Every creature deserves care, exactly as it is, not as someone else believes it should be." Cale considered her words carefully, recognizing in them something he had rarely encountered throughout his life as king, a philosophy entirely absent from the constant political maneuvering and careful posturing that defined his usual existence. Among his own pack, strength was currency, weakness was liability, and vulnerability of any kind was carefully hidden behind layers of controlled composure. With Alira, none of that seemed to matter at all. It was during one such evening, weeks into their quiet, growing companionship, that Cale found himself admitting something he had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Corin, his oldest and most trusted friend. "I don't sleep well," he said quietly, staring into the fire rather than meeting her eyes. "Haven't, for years. My wolf is always alert, always waiting for the next threat, the next challenge to my authority. I've grown so used to it that I barely notice anymore, except on nights like tonight, when I realize how tired I actually am." Alira was quiet for a moment, studying him with the same gentle attentiveness she gave every wounded creature. "That sounds exhausting," she said finally, "carrying that kind of vigilance every single day." "It's necessary," Cale said, though the words carried less conviction than they once had. "A king who lets his guard down invites challenge. Weakness is never forgiven in my world." "There's a difference," Alira said gently, "between weakness and rest. I don't think anyone can lead well for very long without allowing themselves both." Cale glanced at her then, something soft and unguarded flickering across his usually controlled expression. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," Alira admitted, "but it might be necessary, all the same." That night, for reasons neither of them fully examined, Cale stayed longer than usual, the conversation drifting into comfortable silence, as the fire burned low, and the evening deepened around them. When he finally rose to leave, Alira walked him to the door, as she always did, though this time, as he paused on the threshold, something passed between them that neither could quite name. A quiet, charged moment neither seemed willing to break. "Thank you," Cale said quietly, "for not treating me the way everyone else does." You mean like a king, Alira said, a small smile touching her lips. Yes, Cale admitted. It's strangely restful, being simply a man for a little while. Alira reached up then, her hand resting gently against his jaw, the same calm confidence she used with every wounded creature guiding her touch. You're allowed to simply be a man sometimes, she said softly. Even kings need somewhere they can set the weight down. Cale closed his eyes briefly, leaning slightly into her touch before he could stop himself, the warmth of her hand grounding him in a way nothing else in his life ever had. When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted between them, quiet and undeniable, though neither spoke of it directly, as he finally said goodnight and disappeared once more into the darkness of the forest. Unbeknownst to either of them, their growing bond had not gone entirely unnoticed. Back at the mountain hall, Cale's increasingly frequent absences had drawn quiet, worried attention from several members of his council, particularly Rowan, a senior advisor who had served the pack for decades and who viewed any deviation from tradition as a direct threat to the stability he had spent his entire life protecting. Rowan had watched, with growing unease, as Cale returned from his mysterious evening excursions increasingly calm, increasingly distracted, his usual sharp focus on pack matters softening in ways that worried the older wolf considerably. He had made careful inquiries, quiet and discreet, and had learned enough to understand exactly where his king had been spending his evenings, and with whom. A human healer. A woman with no pack, no status, no place at all within the careful, rigid structure that had governed wolf society for generations. And yet Rowan's king seemed increasingly drawn to her, increasingly willing to set aside caution and tradition alike in favor of whatever strange comfort she offered him. Rowan understood, better than most, exactly how dangerous such a bond could become. A king distracted by a human attachment was a king vulnerable to exploitation, vulnerable to rivals who would waste no time using such a weakness against him. And if the old legends were true, if this healer truly was what the whispers suggested, a fated mate capable of standing as Cale's equal, the political upheaval such a bond would cause among traditional pack members could tear the fragile unity Rowan had spent decades helping to build completely apart. He told himself, as he watched Cale slip quietly away from the mountain hall once again that evening, that he was not acting against his king. He was protecting him, protecting the pack, protecting the careful order that had taken generations to establish and could unravel in a single season if left unchecked. It was with that conviction, cold and deliberate, that Rowan began quietly gathering information about Alira, her routines, her vulnerabilities, and most importantly, exactly how she might be used to remind his king where his true loyalties belonged. He had no intention of harming Cale directly. He was too loyal, too devoted to the pack's future for such an extreme betrayal. But the healer, he decided, was a different matter entirely. She was an outsider, expendable in ways his king would never be, and if removing her from the picture meant restoring the king's focus to the responsibilities that truly mattered, then Rowan was prepared to do whatever was necessary to see it done. He began making careful, quiet arrangements that very night, entirely unaware that his actions would soon set in motion a chain of events that would threaten not only Alira's safety, but the very future of the kingdom he believed himself to be protecting. Rowan moved carefully over the following days, aware that any misstep could expose his plan long before it reached completion. He could not act against Alira directly himself, not without risking immediate suspicion falling upon him the moment Cale discovered what had happened. Instead, he reached out quietly to contacts beyond his own pack, wolves from a rival territory, ruled by an ambitious alpha named Dorian, a leader who had long resented Cale's dominance over the region, and who would, Rowan suspected, welcome any opportunity to weaken the Alpha King's position. He met Dorian's messenger, deep in a neutral stretch of forest, far from prying eyes, and explained the situation with careful, measured words, designed to present his betrayal as nothing more than strategic opportunity. A human woman, he explained, had gained unusual influence over the Alpha King, distracting him from his duties and potentially exposing dangerous vulnerabilities that a clever rival might exploit. He did not mention Alira's gift directly, uncertain whether Dorian's pack would believe the old legends, even if he did. He simply painted her as a weakness, a leverage point that, if captured, could force Cale into a position of desperate compromise, weakening his authority across the entire region. Dorian, predictably, saw immediate value in the proposition. A chance to humiliate his greatest rival, to force concessions from a king who had never once needed to bargain from a position of weakness, was an opportunity far too valuable to ignore. Within days, a plan had been quietly set into motion, one that Rowan told himself, with increasingly hollow conviction, was necessary for the greater good of the pack he had sworn his entire life to protect. Meanwhile, entirely unaware of the danger gathering around her, Illyra continued her quiet, steady life in Hollow Creek, tending to wounded creatures by day, and welcoming Cale's increasingly frequent visits by evening. Their bond had deepened considerably over the past weeks, evolving from cautious curiosity into something neither of them could deny any longer, though both remained careful, for different reasons, about naming it too directly. "I spoke with Corin today," Cale admitted one evening, settling into his now familiar seat near her fire. "He asked why I've been so distracted lately." "What did you tell him?" Illyra asked, glancing up from the herbs she was sorting. "Nothing," Cale admitted. "I'm not entirely certain how to explain what this is, even to my closest friend." Illyra set down her herbs, studying him carefully. "Does it need explaining? Or can it simply exist, for now, without a name attached to it?" Cale considered her words for a long moment, something warm and unguarded softening his expression. "I don't think I want it to remain unnamed for much longer," he admitted quietly. "Whatever this is between us, it has become the steadiest, most honest part of my life, and I find I no longer wish to hide it, from my counsel or from myself." Illyra crossed the small distance between them, settling into the chair beside his rather than across from it, close enough that their hands nearly touched. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it's time we stopped pretending we don't already know exactly what this is." Cale reached over slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and rested his hand gently over hers. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the quiet warmth of the cottage wrapping around them like a promise neither was quite ready to voice aloud, though both understood, without needing words, exactly what had settled between them. "I want to bring you to the mountain hall," Cale said finally, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability behind the words. "I want my pack to know you, to understand what you are, and what you've come to mean to me. I'm tired of hiding this in the shadows." Illyra's eyes softened, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her expression as well. "I don't know how your pack will receive a human woman claiming a place beside their king." "Some will resist," Cale admitted honestly. "Change always meets resistance, especially among those who have spent generations believing certain things must never change. But I am the king, and I will not spend my life hiding something this important simply because tradition demands it." Illyra smiled softly, though the uncertainty in her eyes did not entirely fade. "Then I suppose we should find out together, whenever you're ready." They agreed, that evening, that Cale would formally introduce her to his council within the week, once he had prepared the ground carefully enough to minimize the inevitable political upheaval such an announcement would cause. Neither of them knew, as they sat together in the warm glow of her fire, planning a future neither had expected to find, that Rowan's plan was already moving forward far faster than either of them could anticipate. 2 nights later, while Cale remained occupied at the mountain hall settling a dispute between border patrols, Dorian's wolves moved quietly through the forest surrounding Hollow Creek, watching Illyra's cottage from the shadows, exactly as Rowan had instructed them to. Illyra, unaware of the danger gathering outside her door, spent the evening exactly as she spent every other evening, tending her garden until the light faded, then retreating inside to prepare a simple meal, her thoughts drifting comfortably toward Cale, and the future they had begun, tentatively but genuinely, to imagine together. She did not hear the wolves approaching until it was far too late to run. The door burst open with sudden, violent force, and before Illyra could fully process what was happening, 3 large wolves had shifted into their human forms, surrounding her with cold, calculated efficiency. She recognized none of them, understood immediately from their unfamiliar scent and hard, unfriendly expressions that they belonged to no pack she had ever encountered. "You'll come with us quietly," the largest of the 3 said, his voice carrying the same commanding authority she had once heard in Cale's voice, though entirely without the warmth that had grown between them over the past weeks. "And if you do, no harm will come to you." Illyra's mind raced, calm training warring against genuine fear for the first time in longer than she could remember. She thought immediately of Cale, of the danger this could mean for whatever fragile peace existed between rival packs, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that whoever these wolves were, they had not come here by accident. "Who sent you?" she demanded, refusing to let her voice shake despite the fear tightening in her chest. "That," the wolf said, stepping closer, "is not something you need to concern yourself with. Your only concern now is cooperating, unless you'd prefer we simply carry you instead." Elira had no weapon, no training in combat, nothing but the calm, steady resolve that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life. She looked for any opportunity to escape, any advantage she might use, but found herself hopelessly outnumbered against 3 powerful wolves, clearly prepared for exactly this kind of resistance. "You won't get away with this," she said quietly, though even as she spoke the words, she understood how little choice she truly had in the matter. "We already have," the wolf said, and before she could react further, rough hands seized her arms, dragging her out into the cold night air, away from the only home she had ever known, toward a fate she could not yet begin to understand. As they disappeared into the dark forest, carrying her deeper into unfamiliar territory, Elira held on to a single steady thought amid the rising fear threatening to overwhelm her calm. Somewhere, not far from here, Cale would soon discover she was missing. And whatever gentle, patient man she had come to know over the past weeks, she understood, with absolute certainty, that the king beneath that gentleness would not rest until he found her. Cale returned to Hollow Creek later than usual that night, delayed by a lengthy council session that had tested even his considerable patience. He crossed the tree line with the familiar, comfortable anticipation that had become a fixture of his evenings over the past weeks, already imagining the warm glow of Elira's fire and the quiet peace that always settled over him the moment he stepped through her door. That peace shattered the instant he saw her cottage. The front door hung open, splintered along one hinge, swinging gently in the cold night breeze. Cale froze at the edge of her garden, every instinct screaming danger, before his mind had even fully processed the scene in front of him. He crossed the remaining distance in seconds, shifting fully into his wolf form as he moved, senses sharpening instantly as he searched for any trace of what had happened. The scent hit him immediately. Unfamiliar wolves, at least 3 of them, their trail leading away from the cottage and into the forest beyond. Beneath it, faint but unmistakable, lingered Elira's scent, tinged with fear. A low, furious growl tore from his throat, rage unlike anything he had experienced in years, surging through him, with such force that his vision briefly narrowed to a singular focus. Someone had taken her. Someone had come into his territory, into the one place he had allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel something other than the exhausting weight of leadership, and had torn it apart in a single violent moment. He did not return to the mountain hall for reinforcements. He did not pause to consider strategy or caution. He simply followed the trail, running harder and faster than he had ever run in his life, his wolf entirely consumed by a single, driving need to find her before it was too late. The trail led him east, toward the border shared with Dorian's territory, confirming a suspicion that had already begun forming in the back of his mind the moment he recognized the unfamiliar scent. Dorian had long resented his authority, had spent years searching for any weakness he might exploit. If word had somehow reached him about Elira, about the unusual bond forming between her and the Alpha King, it would have been more than enough reason for an ambitious rival to act. Cale ran through the night without pause, driven by a fury and desperation more powerful than anything he had felt even in the fiercest battles of his rise to power. Somewhere along that desperate run, buried beneath the rage, he finally allowed himself to fully acknowledge what he had been reluctant to name, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He loved her. Completely, irrevocably, in a way that made every careful boundary he had built around his heart over years of guarded leadership feel suddenly and completely insignificant. And if any harm came to her because of who she had chosen to let into her life, he did not know if he would ever forgive himself. He reached the border of Dorian's territory just before dawn, and there, in a small clearing surrounded by armed wolves, he found her. Elira stood at the center of the clearing, her hands bound, her expression tense but remarkably composed, given the circumstances, refusing to give her captors the satisfaction of visible fear. Dorian himself stood nearby, along with several of his most trusted warriors, And to Kale's furious disbelief, Rowan stood among them as well, his expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious betrayal his presence represented. "Rowan," Kale said, his voice dangerously quiet as he stepped into the clearing, his wolf form shifting seamlessly back into his human shape, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. "Explain yourself." Rowan did not flinch, though something like regret flickered briefly across his weathered features. "I did what was necessary to protect this pack, my king. Your attachment to this human threatened everything we've built. I could not stand by and watch you compromise generations of careful order for the sake of a fleeting infatuation." "Fleeting infatuation," Kale repeated, fury coiling tight and cold in his chest. "You had no right to make that decision for me." "I had every right," Rowan said, though his conviction wavered slightly under the weight of Kale's furious gaze. "I am sworn to protect this pack, and that includes protecting it from decisions that could tear it apart." Dorian stepped forward then, an unpleasant smile spreading across his face as he studied Kale with obvious satisfaction. "Your own advisor delivered her to me himself, Kale. Quite the show of loyalty from your inner circle. Perhaps your authority isn't quite as absolute as you've always believed." Kale's eyes flashed gold, his wolf pressing hard and furious against the surface of his control, though this time, unlike the strange, gentle surrender he had experienced in Alira's cottage, this pressure demanded violence, demanded justice for the danger threatening the one person who had finally shown him what true peace could feel like. "Release her," Kale said, his voice low and lethal, carrying the full weight of authority that had never once been successfully challenged. "Now, and perhaps I'll consider allowing you to keep your territory intact." Dorian laughed, though there was a nervous edge beneath his bravado. "Bold words, considering you came here alone, Kale. My warriors outnumber you considerably." "Numbers," Kale said, stepping forward with slow, deliberate menace, "have never once been the reason I win." What followed happened swiftly, Kale's fury and desperation combining into something far more devastating than Dorian's warriors had anticipated. He fought with a controlled, ferocious precision, honed through years of hard-won battles, moving through Dorian's warriors with brutal efficiency, refusing to let anything stand between himself and Alira. Rowan, watching the chaos unfold, finally seemed to recognize the full weight of his betrayal, the reality of what he had set into motion crashing down around him, as Kale fought his way steadily closer to where Alira stood bound, and watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Kale, wait!" Alira called out suddenly, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected clarity. "Your wolf, it's losing control. You need to calm down before you lose yourself completely." Kale paused, breathing hard, his wolf pressing dangerously close to the surface, fury and instinct threatening to overwhelm the careful control he had maintained, even in his fiercest battles. He looked toward her, and in that single, charged moment, everything else faded away. Dorian's remaining warriors, Rowan's guilty expression, the chaos of battle around him, all of it reduced to insignificance beside the sight of her standing there, frightened but alive, watching him with the same calm, steady faith she had shown him from the very beginning. He crossed the remaining distance to her, in 3 swift strides, tearing through the ropes binding her wrists with careful, controlled precision, despite the fury still burning through his veins. The moment she was free, she reached up instinctively, pressing her palm against his chest, exactly as she had done the first night his wolf had surrendered at her feet. "Breathe," she said softly, her voice cutting through the chaos of battle and fury alike. "I'm here. I'm safe now. You don't need to fight the whole world at once." Kale closed his eyes briefly, feeling his wolf respond immediately to her touch, exactly as it had that very first night, the fury slowly settling into something calmer, something more controlled, though no less fiercely protective. Dorian, seeing his advantage slipping away entirely, made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation, lunging toward them with claws extended. Kale moved instinctively, placing himself firmly between Alira and the attack, meeting Dorian's assault with controlled, decisive force that ended the confrontation within moments, leaving the rival alpha subdued and thoroughly defeated at his feet. The remaining warriors, seeing their leader defeated so thoroughly and so swiftly, quickly abandoned any further resistance, several of them already backing away toward the tree line, rather than risk facing the Alpha King's fury themselves. Rowan alone remained, standing motionless in the clearing, his expression heavy with the full weight of consequences he had brought entirely upon himself. "I did this to protect the pack," he said quietly, though the words carried little conviction now, faced directly with the aftermath of his actions. "You did this out of fear," Cale said, his voice cold but no longer explosive, the immediate danger having passed enough to allow calmer judgment to return. Fear of change, fear of anything that challenged the world you understood. "That fear nearly cost me everything that matters." Rowan lowered his head, offering no further defense, understanding fully that whatever punishment awaited him back at the mountain hall, he had earned it entirely through his own choices. Cale turned back to Alira then, his expression softening completely as he studied her carefully, checking for any injury the darkness might have hidden from him. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the harsh authority he had used moments before. "No," Alira said softly, though her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline of the night finally began to fade. "Frightened, but not hurt." Cale pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close, as the tension of the battle slowly drained away, replaced by overwhelming relief that she was safe, that he had reached her in time. "I should have protected you better," he murmured against her hair. "I should never have let this happen." "You came for me," Alira said softly, her arms wrapping around him in return. "That's what matters. You came, and you fought for me, and I never once doubted that you would." As the first light of dawn began to break over the clearing, illuminating the aftermath of the confrontation, Cale held her close, understanding with absolute clarity that whatever old legend Leora had described, whatever fated bond existed between them, none of it mattered nearly as much as the simple, undeniable truth settling firmly into his heart. He loved her, completely and without reservation, and he would spend the rest of his life proving exactly how far he was willing to go to protect that love, no matter what challenges still lay ahead. The journey back to the mountain hall passed quietly, Cale keeping Alira close beside him the entire way, his usual vigilant control softened by lingering worry that refused to fully release its grip until they were safely within the borders of his own territory. Rowan walked ahead of them under guard, his silence heavy with the weight of consequences he now understood he could not avoid. News of the confrontation had already begun spreading through the pack by the time they arrived. Whispered accounts of the Alpha King fighting alone against a rival territory to rescue a human healer, of his own trusted advisor betraying him in the process. By the time Cale led Alira through the gates of the mountain hall, a crowd had gathered, curious and uncertain, watching the unfolding scene with a mixture of concern and open curiosity. Corin was the first to reach them, relief evident on his face, as he took in Cale's exhausted but unharmed appearance. "Thank the ancestors," he said, gripping Cale's shoulder firmly. "We heard rumors of an attack near the eastern border. I feared the worst." "The worst nearly happened," Cale admitted, his arm still protectively around Alira's shoulders. "But it didn't, thanks to reaching her in time." Corin's gaze shifted to Alira, studying her with open curiosity rather than suspicion, a warmth in his expression that suggested he had already suspected far more about his king's recent behavior than he had ever openly acknowledged. "So this is the healer who has occupied so much of your attention lately." "This is Alira," Cale said simply, and something in the way he said her name, steady and unguarded, carried more meaning than any lengthy explanation could have offered. Corin inclined his head respectfully toward her. "Whatever you did to calm this one's wolf," he said, a hint of dry humor breaking through the tension of the morning. "The entire pack owes you a debt of gratitude. He's been considerably less insufferable since he met you." Despite the exhaustion and lingering fear from the night's events, Alira found herself smiling at the easy warmth between the two old friends, a small, genuine moment of normalcy amid the chaos of everything that had happened. Cale addressed his gathered pack directly then, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, with the same commanding authority that had guided them through years of leadership, though something gentler now underlaid his words as well. "Rowan betrayed this pack," he said, gesturing toward his former advisor, still standing under guard nearby. "Not out of malice, but out of fear, a fear that change of any kind threatens the order we've worked so hard to build. I understand that fear, even as I cannot excuse the actions it drove him to take." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd, meeting the eyes of pack members who had served him loyally for years. many of whom he suspected shared at least some of Rowan's underlying concerns, even if none had acted on them so drastically. "I know many of you have questions about what this means for our future," Cale continued, "about what it means to have a human healer standing beside your king. I won't pretend those questions aren't valid, or that change doesn't carry real challenges alongside it. But I will say this: strength has never been measured only in claws and battle. It is also measured in compassion, in the courage to heal rather than destroy, and in the wisdom to recognize when something different might make us stronger rather than weaker." He turned to look at Elira then, his expression softening completely, all pretense of careful political posturing falling away in favor of simple, honest truth. "Elira has shown me more genuine strength in these past weeks than I have witnessed in years of battles and political maneuvering combined. She has shown me that a king can set down his burdens without losing his authority, that vulnerability is not the same as weakness, and that even the fiercest heart deserves rest." He knelt then, before his entire assembled pack, an act of humility no one present had ever witnessed from their king, taking Elira's hand gently in his own. "I choose her," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, "not because ancient legend demands it, but because my heart has already made this choice, and I no longer wish to hide it." A long moment of stunned silence followed, the entire pack absorbing the significance of what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, Leora stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face carrying an expression of quiet pride as she addressed the gathered pack. "I have lived through many generations of leadership," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom few present could match. "I have seen kings rule through fear alone, and I have seen the damage such rule eventually causes. What I witness today is something far rarer and far more valuable. A king strong enough to kneel, wise enough to recognize genuine strength when he finds it, regardless of where that strength comes from." She turned to address the crowd directly. The old legend spoke of a soothing heart capable of calming even the fiercest wolf spirit. "I did not believe, until recently, that I would live to see such a legend proven true. But I have watched our king these past weeks, calmer, steadier, more genuinely himself than I have seen him in years. Whatever bond exists between them, it has made him stronger, not weaker." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertainty gradually giving way to something closer to acceptance, particularly as several pack members who had themselves been healed by Elira over the past months stepped forward to offer their own quiet testimonies of her genuine, unwavering compassion. Finn, the very first wolf Elira had ever healed, pushed his way through the crowd, his expression earnest and determined. "She saved my life," he said, addressing the gathered pack directly. "Asked nothing in return, expected no loyalty, no debt, nothing, except that I heal and find my own way forward. If that is the kind of person our king has chosen, I for one welcome her." Gradually, one by one, other voices joined his, wolves, who had crossed paths with Elira's gentle strength over the past months, each adding their own quiet support, until the uncertain murmur of the crowd shifted, slowly but genuinely, toward acceptance. As for Rowan, Cale addressed his punishment with the same balance of firmness and fairness that had come to define his leadership. Rather than the severe consequences tradition might have once demanded, Cale chose instead to strip him of his advisory position, while allowing him to remain within the pack, a decision meant to demonstrate that even betrayal born from misguided loyalty could be met with justice, tempered by understanding, rather than pure vengeance. "You believed you were protecting this pack," Cale told him privately, before the formal proceedings concluded. "I understand that fear, even though your actions nearly cost me everything. Perhaps, in time, you'll come to understand that true strength isn't found in resisting change, but in adapting wisely enough to guide it." Rowan, humbled and genuinely remorseful, accepted his reduced role without complaint, understanding that Cale's mercy, though firm, offered him a path toward eventually earning back the trust he had so carelessly broken. In the weeks that followed, Elira gradually settled into her new life within the mountain hall, her healing gifts extending now to the entire pack rather than only the wounded wolves who had once found their way to her cottage door. She continued her work with the same quiet, unwavering compassion that had first drawn Cale to her, though now she did so openly, respected and valued by the very pack that had once viewed her with cautious uncertainty. Kale, in turn, found himself a steadier, more balanced ruler than he had ever been before. His fierce authority now tempered by genuine warmth. His exhausting vigilance finally allowed regular moments of true rest, exactly as Alira had always insisted every creature, wolf or human, deserved. Their bond, exactly as the old legend had promised, reshaped not only their own lives, but the very future of the kingdom itself, blending strength with compassion, in a way that ushered in an era of peace far more resilient than any built purely on dominance and fear. On a quiet evening months later, as Kale and Alira stood together on the balcony, overlooking the mountain territory that was now fully hers as much as his, he wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin gently atop her head, as they watched the sun set over the peaceful lands below. "I came here once to punish you," he murmured softly, memory and affection mingling warmly in his voice. "Instead, you healed something in me I didn't even know was broken." Alira turned in his arms, smiling up at him with the same calm, steady warmth that had first drawn his wolf to surrender so completely at her feet. "That," she said gently, "is simply what I do. I heal every wolf who comes to me with an open heart. I just never expected the fiercest one of all to end up staying." Kale leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, the Alpha King finally, completely at peace, his beast forever calmed by the quiet, unwavering healer who had, against every expectation, become not his punishment, but his home.